252 million years ago, life nearly vanished from the Earth. It was not an asteroid. There was no sudden impact, no explosion visible from space, no single moment that divided before from after. It was something slower, more relentless, and in many ways more terrifying. An accumulation of catastrophes feeding on each other for tens of thousands of years, turning the planet into an increasingly hostile place, until 96% of all marine species and 70% of all land species ceased to exist forever. We call it the Great Permian Extinction. It is also known as the Great Dying. It is the worst episode of mass destruction of life this planet has known in the last 500 million years, and yet it is the mass extinction that almost no one talks about. When we think of extinctions, we think of the dinosaurs and the asteroid. The Permian extinction was incomparably greater, and its story is incomparably stranger. The late Permian trilobites deserve special attention, because their story is one of the longest and most successful in the fossil record. Those segmented arthropods with compound eyes had appeared at the beginning of the Cambrian, more than 500 million years ago, and had survived every prior mass extinction. They had seen the first fish appear and disappear, the first amphibians, the first reptiles. They had crossed the Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction, the late Carboniferous extinction. And in the late Permian, reduced already to just a few families by prior extinctions, they were still surviving, still diversifying in the tropical seas of the Tethys. And then, in the space of a few thousand years, they vanished forever. Tonight we are going to explore it together. But before we explore how it ended, we need to understand what came before. We need to know the world that was lost, because that world was also extraordinary. If you could travel back in time to the late Permian, about 260 million years ago, you would find an unrecognizable planet. The continents were joined in a single supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by a single global ocean called Panthalassa. The climate was warm in the tropical regions and cold at the poles, but in ways different from today. The tropical seas were shallow and extraordinarily rich in life. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is a good moment. Every week we explore a different world with a calm narration designed to accompany your rest. The world of the late Permian land fauna is also worth picturing in detail. The dicynodont herbivores came in sizes ranging from that of a rat to that of a large ox, and some species were highly gregarious, forming enormous herds that moved across the Permian landscape in search of vegetation. Their barrel-shaped bodies and horned beaks gave them an appearance unlike anything alive today, though their lifestyle was in some ways comparable to that of modern large herbivores like wildebeest or bison. They were prey to the gorgonopsids, which stalked them across the Permian savannas much as lions stalk wildebeest today, in a predator-prey dynamic that had been refined over millions of years and that the extinction would erase completely. In those late Permian seas lived the trilobites, one of the most successful groups of animals in the history of the Earth, which had survived everything the planet had thrown at them for 300 million years. There lived the brachiopods, shell-like organisms that covered the seafloor in densities difficult to imagine. There lived the rugose and tabulate corals, which built reefs as extensive as modern ones. There lived the crinoids, flower-like animals that swayed in the submarine currents in meadows stretching for kilometers. It was an ecosystem of complexity and richness that had taken 100 million years to develop. And it was about to disappear almost entirely. The late Permian atmospheric chemistry also influenced the types of organisms that dominated the plankton, and through the plankton, the entire ocean food web. The Permian ocean plankton was dominated by different groups than those that dominate today, including various types of calcareous and siliceous protists that formed the base of the marine food chain. Those plankton communities collapsed during the extinction, removing the foundation of the food web from the bottom up. Without abundant plankton to feed filter feeders and small predators, And without those small organisms to feed larger predators, the entire pelagic ecosystem unraveled in a cascade of trophic collapse that paralleled the collapse occurring simultaneously in the benthic communities on the seafloor. On land, the late Permian was equally extraordinary. Forests of tree ferns and primitive conifers covered vast stretches of the continents. Amphibians coexisted with the first large reptiles. And among those reptiles stood a group that almost no one knows today but which at the time dominated the terrestrial ecosystems: the synapsids. They were not dinosaurs and they were not mammals, but they were the direct ancestors of the mammals, and therefore our own ancestors in geological time. Among them stood the gorgonopsids, predators up to 4 meters long with enormous fangs, and the dicynodonts, herbivores that lived in herds and had colonized virtually every ecological niche available. It was their world, and they were about to lose it. The brachiopods were equally abundant. In some late Permian sediments, brachiopods form layers so dense that geologists describe them as shell pavements, stretches of seafloor where shells accumulated in layers several centimeters thick. They were the dominant filter feeders of the Permian seafloor, organisms that opened their valves to filter phytoplankton from the surrounding water, and which in turn served as food for predators of all sizes. Their disappearance left a void in the structure of marine ecosystems that took millions of years to be partially filled by bivalves, which occupied similar niches but never reached the diversity that the brachiopods had possessed. The sulfur dioxide released by the eruptions also had short-term effects that complemented and complicated the long-term effects of carbon dioxide. Unlike carbon dioxide, which remains in the atmosphere for tens of thousands of years, sulfur dioxide quickly converts to sulfate, which forms aerosols that reflect sunlight and produce temporary cooling. The most intense eruptions of the Siberian traps likely produced temperature oscillations, periods of sharp cooling during and just after the most intense eruptions, followed by periods of accentuated warming when the sulfates had deposited and the greenhouse effect of accumulated carbon dioxide dominated again. Those temperature oscillations, superimposed on the background warming, could have been particularly destructive for organisms that could only survive within narrow temperature ranges. The crinoids, the so-called sea lilies, were perhaps the most visually striking organisms of the late Permian seafloor. Anchored to the substrate by a calcareous stalk and with their feathery arms extended into the current to capture food particles, they formed submarine gardens that covered enormous areas of the seafloor. In Permian reefs, crinoids were so abundant that their skeletal fragments form limestone layers several meters thick. The Permian extinction did not completely eliminate the crinoids, but it did drastically reduce their diversity, from several hundred genera to just a few forms that survived to repopulate the Triassic oceans. The non-herbivore synapsids also deserve mention. The dicynodont herbivores coexisted with carnivores of all sizes, from small insectivores to the 4-meter gorgonopsids. But there were also intermediate groups, the Biarmasuchia, the Therocephalians, the primitive cynodonts, each occupying a particular niche in the late Permian terrestrial ecosystems. It was a terrestrial fauna of a diversity comparable to that of modern mammal ecosystems, built on a different body plan but equally elaborate. And that fauna took 250 million years to rebuild, through the dinosaurs and then through the mammals, until it again reached the complexity it had before the Permian extinction. The late Permian world also had a complex atmospheric chemistry that influenced the ecosystems in ways scientists are still researching. Oxygen levels in the late Permian atmosphere were somewhat lower than today, which may have already placed physiological stress on some organisms. Carbon dioxide levels were also changing in response to the vast forests that covered the continents, since those forests absorbed enormous quantities of carbon through photosynthesis. The balance of gases in the atmosphere was already shifting before the volcanic catastrophe that would finally destroy that world, and some researchers argue that those pre-existing stresses made the Permian ecosystems more vulnerable to the additional shocks that the Siberian traps would soon deliver. The climate models most recently used to simulate the late Permian conditions show that the warming did not occur uniformly across the entire planet. Tropical regions, where temperatures were already high, were most affected because they more easily exceeded the physiological thresholds of the organisms that inhabited them. Temperate regions took longer to warm to lethal levels, and polar regions benefited from a paradoxical effect. Warming reduced polar ice, freeing regions that were previously ice-covered and that could now be colonized by organisms from lower latitudes. For that reason, the survivors of the Permian extinction in polar regions are relatively more diverse than in the tropics. The main cause of the Great Permian Extinction was volcanism. The question of why some species survived the Permian extinction while closely related ones did not has occupied paleontologists for decades and has still not been fully answered. Geographic location played a role. Species that happened to live in refugia, regions where the combination of temperature, oxygen, and water chemistry remained within survivable ranges for longer than elsewhere, had more time to adapt or simply to persist until conditions improved. Body size also played a role. Smaller organisms with faster generation times could adapt more rapidly to changing conditions than larger organisms with longer generation times. Physiological flexibility was critical. Organisms that could tolerate a wide range of temperatures, oxygen levels, and water chemistries were more likely to survive than those tuned to specific conditions. Not a single volcano. Not a single eruption. But the largest episode of continental volcanism in the last 500 million years. The Siberian Traps. An area of more than 2 million square kilometers, approximately the size of Western Europe, that began to be covered in basaltic lava at the precise moment the extinction was beginning. The eruptions did not occur all at once, but in pulses that continued for several million years, though the most intense ones coincided exactly with the peak of the extinction. The Siberian traps released into the atmosphere quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide that are almost impossible to imagine. Current estimates suggest that during the periods of greatest activity, these eruptions could release as many greenhouse gases as all current human activity in the space of a few thousand years. The immediate effect was massive and rapid global warming. Global temperatures rose between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius. In tropical regions, the sea reached temperatures of 40 degrees, a level at which most marine organisms cannot survive. The biogeographic legacy of the Permian extinction can also be read in the modern distribution of marine invertebrate groups. The Pacific Ocean, which is the oldest of the modern ocean basins and which maintained connectivity to the ancient Panthalassa Ocean through the Triassic and Jurassic, contains a higher diversity of many marine invertebrate groups than the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. That higher Pacific diversity in part reflects the greater time available for evolutionary diversification in the Pacific Basin, which was the primary refuge for many of the marine lineages that survived the Permian extinction and began the long process of evolutionary recovery. The forests of the late Permian were connected to the marine ecosystems in ways that amplified the effects of the extinction in both directions. The coastal forests stabilized soils and regulated the runoff of nutrients into the sea. When those forests disappeared, the soils eroded and enormous quantities of sediment and nutrients flowed into the oceans, triggering algal blooms that consumed dissolved oxygen and added anoxic stress to the already deteriorated ocean conditions. At the same time, the disappearance of the marine reefs affected the coastal systems, which lost the physical protection that reefs provide against storms and coastal erosion. But the warming was only the beginning. The carbon dioxide released by the eruptions dissolved in the oceans, acidifying them. Organisms with calcium carbonate shells, such as trilobites, brachiopods, and corals, found that the seawater was beginning to actively dissolve their skeletons. It was like trying to build a house while someone was dissolving the bricks from within. At the same time, the warming of the water drastically reduced its capacity to dissolve oxygen. The oceans began to suffer from anoxia, a severe reduction in dissolved oxygen. In the deepest and warmest zones, Anaerobic bacteria that thrive in the absence of oxygen began to produce hydrogen sulfide, a gas highly toxic to virtually all complex life. That hydrogen sulfide accumulated in the deep waters and eventually began to rise toward the surface, creating death zones that extended from the seafloor upward. The process is called euxinia, and in the late Permian it turned vast stretches of the ocean into zones where no animal could survive. There was also another factor, perhaps the most treacherous of all. When global warming reached a certain intensity, it began to melt the methane clathrates, deposits of ice mixed with methane gas that existed on the ocean floor and in the Arctic regions. Methane is a greenhouse gas far more potent than carbon dioxide. Its massive release amplified the already ongoing warming, creating a feedback cycle that made it increasingly difficult to stop the process. More heat melted more clathrates, which released more methane, which produced more heat. A vicious circle on a planetary scale. The geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary in continental sediments also shows signals of a profoundly disturbed hydrological system. The rivers of the late Permian were primarily single-channel, braided in stable networks over floodplains covered in vegetation. At the boundary with the Triassic, those rivers abruptly changed to multi-channel, braided systems, a signal that the disappearance of vegetation had eliminated the stabilization of the riverbanks. Rivers without bank vegetation migrate and change course constantly, transporting enormous quantities of sediment without depositing it in an orderly way. That change in fluvial systems is documented in rock formations on all continents, and constitutes one of the clearest pieces of evidence of the devastation the extinction produced in terrestrial ecosystems. The Permian extinction also reminds us that complex ecosystems are not the default state of the biosphere, but rather an achievement that requires both time and stability to maintain. The simple microbial world that dominated the early Triassic oceans is in many ways the baseline state of Earth's biology. It requires no complex ecological structure, no elaborate food webs, no delicate interdependencies between specialized species. The complex, diverse, multi-trophic ecosystems that we see in the modern ocean and on land are structures built by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation, maintained by the ongoing interactions between their components. They are not robust to arbitrary perturbation. They require the conditions under which they evolved to continue functioning as they have evolved to function. The Permian extinction shows what happens when those conditions change faster than the ecosystems can adapt. The speed of the collapse is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Permian extinction. The most precise studies of the rocks at the Permian-Triassic boundary suggest that the most acute phase of the extinction, the period in which most species disappeared, lasted less than 60,000 years. Some studies point to an even shorter period of just 20,000 years. In geological terms, that is virtually instantaneous. In human terms, it is long enough for many generations to be born and die without seeing the beginning or the end of the catastrophe, but short enough that ecosystems had no time to adapt. The marine invertebrate fauna that characterized the Paleozoic, often called the Paleozoic evolutionary fauna by paleontologists, was almost entirely replaced by the modern evolutionary fauna in the aftermath of the Permian extinction. The Paleozoic evolutionary fauna was dominated by brachiopods, crinoids, rugose corals, trilobites, and other groups that had diversified in the Cambrian and Ordovician. The modern evolutionary fauna, dominated by bivalves, gastropods, echinoids, and teleost fish, is the one that characterizes today's oceans. The Permian extinction was the event that drove the transition between these two worlds, effectively replacing one ocean with another at the level of its dominant inhabitants. The gorgonopsids disappeared completely. Not a single species survived. The dicynodonts were reduced to just a few species. The rugose and tabulate corals, which had been building reefs for hundreds of millions of years, went extinct without leaving descendants. The trilobites, which had survived everything for 300 million years, disappeared forever. With them went 90% of all marine animal families, a diversity that life had taken hundreds of millions of years to build. The oceans were dominated for millions of years by bacterial organisms. Coral reefs disappeared for 10 million years. The fossil record of the early Triassic shows a poverty of marine life that contrasts brutally with the richness of the late Permian that preceded it. Scientists call it the recovery interval, but that expression softens what it really was, a period of 10 million years during which life on Earth was a shadow of what it had been. The geographic distribution of survivors has also proven informative in unexpected ways. Phylogenetic analyses, which reconstruct the evolutionary relationships between organisms from their morphological or molecular characteristics, have allowed identification of which living forms today descend from lineages that survived in specific geographic regions during the Permian extinction. Those reconstructions show that many of the groups of marine organisms alive today have their roots in lineages that survived in the cooler water regions of the late Permian, far from the overheated tropics where the extinction was most complete. The terrestrial ecosystem collapse also followed a predictable sequence that the fossil record confirms. The primary producers, the plants, were the first to be affected by the combination of acid rain, soil poisoning, and extreme heat. Without plants, herbivores lost their food source. Without herbivores, mid-level carnivores lost their prey. And without that prey, the large predators like the gorgonopsids, which were already few in number because of their position at the top of the food chain, could not sustain their populations. The extinction propagated upward through the food chain, eliminating first the specialists and then the generalists, until only the most resistant organisms with the broadest diets remained. The temperatures in the equatorial regions during the worst of the Permian extinction likely reached levels that make photosynthesis impossible in most land plants. Studies of oxygen isotopes in early Triassic sediments suggest that temperatures in the shallow tropical oceans may have exceeded 40 degrees for prolonged periods. On land, with the additional effect of continental heating, temperatures in equatorial zones could have reached levels today only found in the hottest deserts on Earth. A thermal dead zone, in which neither plants could survive nor animals could reproduce, would have extended along the equator during the most intense millions of years of the extinction. The collapse of the terrestrial food chain during the Permian extinction is equally devastating to contemplate. The story of corals is particularly instructive in this regard. The rugose and tabulate corals that built the Paleozoic reefs went extinct in the Permian. The scleractinian corals that build modern reefs, which are completely different from the Paleozoic corals at the morphological and molecular level, appeared in the Middle Triassic. For a long time, paleontologists debated whether scleractinian corals descended from the rugose and tabulate corals of the Permian or had evolved independently from non-calcifying anemones that had survived the extinction. Current evidence points to the second hypothesis. Modern corals are not the descendants of Permian corals, but evolved anew from anemones after the extinction. The Permian extinction did not just eliminate the reef builders of the Paleozoic, it erased everything that made them capable of building reefs, forcing evolution to reinvent the symbiosis between cnidarians and photosynthetic algae that is the foundation of coral reefs. The late Permian forests disappeared. Not gradually, but abruptly in the fossil record. The acid rain produced by the sulfur dioxide emitted by the Siberian eruptions fell on forest soils, acidifying them and releasing heavy metals that normally remain fixed in the soil minerals. The poisoned soils could no longer support vegetation. Without vegetation, runoff eroded the soils. Without soils, terrestrial ecosystems collapsed from the base of the food chain upward. The role of the Permian extinction in shaping the deep history of terrestrial plant communities is also significant and often overlooked. The Permian ended a long era of coal swamp forests dominated by lycopsid trees, cordatalian conifers, and seed ferns. The Triassic saw the rise of new plant groups better suited to the drier and more seasonal climates that characterized much of Pangaea after the extinction. cycads, ginkgos, and various conifer lineages that are still represented in today's flora expanded dramatically in the Triassic, while the lycopsid trees that had dominated the Carboniferous and early Permian were reduced to a small number of surviving lineages. The plant world we see today, dominated by angiosperms but with deep evolutionary roots in Mesozoic gymnosperms, traces part of its ancestry to the survivors of the Permian plant extinction. Massive wildfires left a distinctive geological signature in the rocks of the Permian-Triassic boundary. Layers of charcoal, called fusane, found across the entire Earth in sediments of that age. The planet burned. And when the forests burned, the herbivores that depended on them disappeared. And when the herbivores disappeared, the predators that depended on them disappeared too. The mechanism of Siberian trap volcanism is more complex than it appears at first glance. The eruptions were not simply the result of a hot spot in the mantle, like those that produced the Hawaiian Islands. They were the result of an interaction between rising hot mantle material and the particular structure of the Siberian continental crust, which at that time was thicker and more stable than many other regions. When the mantle material rose and began to melt the base of the continental crust, it released not only basaltic lava but also the gases contained in the sedimentary rocks that the heat of the magma was transforming. Carbonates that became carbon dioxide, evaporites that released sulfur dioxide and hydrochloric acid, carbon-rich sediments that released methane and other hydrocarbons. The Meishan section in China is a place of pilgrimage for paleontologists specializing in mass extinctions. In a rock outcrop just a few meters tall, the history of the worst biological disaster of the last 500 million years is compressed. The rock layers are read from bottom to top like the pages of a book. First the fossil-rich sediments of the late Permian, with their trilobites and brachiopods and corals, then the thin clay band of the boundary, and then the early Triassic, poor and desolate, with barely a few generalist organisms that bear witness to the devastation that has just occurred. That release of gases from encased sediments, called thermogenic degassing, may have been as important as the volcanic eruptions themselves in terms of the quantity of greenhouse gases added to the atmosphere. The most recent calculations suggest that the amount of carbon dioxide released by the degassing of the Siberian sediments could have been comparable or superior to that released directly by the magma. That means the Siberian traps were not only a source of lava, but also an extremely efficient gas release system that affected not only the atmosphere but also the local geochemistry of soils and groundwater. The evidence for temperature as the primary killing mechanism in the marine realm during the Permian extinction has been strengthened by studies of biogeographic patterns across the boundary. If temperature was the primary driver of extinction, we would expect tropical species to suffer higher extinction rates than those at higher latitudes, because tropical species are typically adapted to narrower temperature ranges and more stable conditions. That is precisely what the fossil record shows. The tropics experienced the most severe and most prolonged extinction, while higher latitude faunas, though also severely affected, show relatively more survivors. That geographic pattern is one of the most powerful lines of evidence for the thermal killing hypothesis. The evolutionary history of ammonites after the Permian extinction is also a lesson about the diversification capacity of surviving lineages. The few ammonite genera that survived the extinction found themselves in an ocean practically empty of competitors. Under those conditions, evolutionary diversification was rapid and extraordinarily productive. In less than 10 million years, from those few survivors, ammonites had generated dozens of new genera with radically different shell shapes. Some developed uncoiled or helical shells. Others developed elaborate ornamentation, ribs, tubercles, spines, that probably served to protect them from the new predators that were also diversifying. The evolutionary radiation of ammonites in the Triassic is one of the most impressive examples of rapid adaptive diversification in the fossil record. On land, the cynodonts, the group of synapsids from which the mammals would evolve, also show a post-extinction diversification pattern that is in retrospect extraordinarily significant. The Triassic cynodonts were mostly small animals, the size of rats or weasels, with a physiology that was progressively becoming more similar to that of mammals. Greater brain capacity, differentiated teeth for different functions, a more upright posture, and probably already some degree of body temperature regulation. Those adaptations, which in the late Permian were still incipient, developed and were perfected during the Triassic in the context of ecosystems where the niches of small predator and small herbivore were available without intense competition. Carbon isotopes are particularly informative. Carbon has two stable isotopes, carbon-12 and carbon-13, and photosynthetic organisms prefer carbon-12 when building their tissues. For that reason, the organic carbon of organisms is relatively poor in carbon-13 compared with the inorganic carbon of seawater. When organisms die and settle on the seafloor, they enrich sediments in carbon-12. When ocean productivity collapses, the ocean becomes enriched in carbon-13 because it is no longer being consumed by organisms. That produces a detectable change in the ratio of carbon isotopes that geologists can measure in sediments, and that change, called a negative carbon-13 excursion, is precisely what is observed at Maishan and in hundreds of other Permian-Triassic boundary sections around the world. It is the chemical signature of the collapse of life in the oceans. Insect groups that survived also deserve mention, because insects are rarely the center of attention in narratives about mass extinctions but are crucial to the functioning of terrestrial ecosystems. Insects, with their capacity to reproduce rapidly, their small size and their extraordinary metabolic diversity, survived the Permian extinction in far greater proportion than vertebrates. And that survival was fundamental to the recovery of terrestrial ecosystems, because insects are pollinators, decomposers, predators, and prey in proportions that no other animal group can match. One of the most compelling aspects of the Permian extinction story is the sheer quantity of information that has been extracted from such ancient rocks in such a short period of scientific time. The serious scientific study of the Permian-Triassic boundary began in earnest only in the 1970s and 1980s, when improved analytical techniques and a growing interest in mass extinctions following the asteroid impact hypothesis for the end Cretaceous extinction made the Permian extinction a major focus of paleontological research. In the 40 years since, the understanding of the event has been transformed almost beyond recognition. What was once thought to be a gradual process extending over millions of years is now understood to be a geologically instantaneous catastrophe. What was once a mystery in terms of its cause is now understood in considerable mechanistic detail. The recovery of terrestrial vegetation was the main limiting factor on land. Without vegetation, there were no stable soils. Without stable soils, there was no vegetation. That negative feedback cycle delayed the recovery of terrestrial ecosystems in many regions for more than 2 million years. The vegetation that finally recolonized the early Triassic soils was dominated by few highly resistant species, mainly ferns and some primitive conifers, that could grow in poor and degraded soils. Forest diversity took much longer to recover than the simple presence of vegetation. The history of stromatolites in the early Triassic is especially significant from an evolutionary perspective. Stromatolites, structures formed by layers of microbes, primarily cyanobacteria, that trap sediment and build mounds or mats on the seafloor, had dominated the Precambrian oceans for billions of years. The appearance of soft-bodied animals in the Ediacaran and then of animals with skeletons in the Cambrian had displaced stromatolites from most marine environments, because the animals that fed by scraping the seafloor, called bioturbators, destroyed the microbial mats before they could consolidate. The Permian extinction temporarily eliminated those bioturbators, and in the absence of animals to destroy them, microbial mats and stromatolites once again dominated the world's seafloors. The recovery of the world after the Great Permian extinction was slow, irregular, and full of setbacks. The first million years of the Triassic were a period of ecological poverty almost without precedent. In some early Triassic rock formations, geologists find stromatolite structures that had been the dominant ecosystems in the Precambrian seas more than 500 million years before. The Permian extinction had rolled back the ecological complexity of the oceans to a state that recalled the world before animals. The first million years of the Triassic were a period of ecological poverty almost without precedent. The oceans were dominated by bacterial mats that thrive in conditions of low oxygen and high temperature that are lethal to most animals. In some early Triassic rock formations, geologists find structures called stromatolites that had been the dominant ecosystems in the Precambrian seas, more than 500 million years before. The Permian extinction had rolled back the ecological complexity of the oceans to a state that recalled the world before animals. The debate among scientists about the factors that limited recovery remains active. Some researchers argue that relapses in environmental conditions produced by minor volcanic pulses during the early Triassic were the main factor that delayed recovery. Others argue that the intrinsically slow recovery of complex ecosystems, which requires the gradual reconstruction of food webs from primary producers to top predators, is sufficient to explain the 10 million years it took for biodiversity to recover to levels comparable to the late Permian. Both factors likely contributed in different degrees in different regions and groups of organisms. The duration of 10 to 15 million years for the complete recovery of post-Permian biodiversity has important implications for thinking about current mass extinctions. If the current loss of biodiversity reached the magnitude of the Permian extinction, the recovery of that diversity would not occur in any time scale relevant to human civilization. 10 million years is approximately 30 times the duration of the entire genus Homo. The biodiversity that is lost in a mass extinction does not recover for us, nor for our descendants, nor for any generation of human beings we can imagine. The geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary also preserves evidence of what the world looked like during the recovery, not just during the crisis. The early Triassic is a world of strange and simplified ecosystems, where organisms that would have been ecological curiosities in the Permian became dominant by default. The stromatolite-dominated seafloors, the Lystrosaurus-dominated landscapes, the fish-dominated open ocean. These are not the ecosystems we would have predicted from the diversity of the Permian. They are the ecosystems built by survivors in a world emptied of competition, and they have a haunting quality when contemplated, a world fully functional in its basic processes but eerily quiet in its diversity, like a vast hall that once rang with thousands of voices and now echoes with just a few. Among the non-vertebrate groups, the bivalves emerged as unexpected winners of the post-Permian world. In the Permian, bivalves had been a relatively minor group compared with the brachiopods that dominated similar ecological roles. But bivalves proved more resistant to the combination of warming, acidification, and anoxia that destroyed the brachiopods. In the early Triassic, with the brachiopods reduced to a fraction of their former diversity, bivalves expanded rapidly to fill the ecological space that brachiopods had vacated. Today, bivalves are among the most diverse and ecologically important groups of marine invertebrates, with thousands of species occupying virtually every available marine habitat. Their dominance today is a direct legacy of the competitive asymmetry revealed by the Permian extinction. That clay band also contains a chemical signature that scientists have learned to read like a text. Mercury, an element that volcanoes release in extraordinarily high quantities, is found in anomalous concentrations right at the boundary, confirming the massive volcanic activity of the Siberian traps. The carbon isotopes show an enormous disturbance, a signal that the chemistry of the oceans and the atmosphere changed radically and rapidly. The oxygen isotopes record the warming. The sulfur isotopes record the anoxia and euxinia. Each of those geochemical proxies is a different window into the same catastrophic event. The connection between the Permian extinction and the subsequent evolution of warm-blooded physiology in the synapsid lineage is one of the most intriguing hypotheses in vertebrate paleontology. The conditions of the early Triassic world, With its extreme temperatures, its low atmospheric oxygen, and its highly seasonal climate, placed enormous selective pressure on the surviving synapsids. The ability to regulate body temperature internally, to remain active across a wide temperature range, and to sustain metabolic activity even when food was scarce, would have been enormously advantageous under those conditions. Some researchers have proposed that the origin of mammalian endothermy, one of the defining characteristics of our class, was driven partly by the selection pressures of the post-Permian world. If so, we are warm-blooded not just because warm blood is generally advantageous, but because the Permian extinction created a world in which being warm-blooded was the difference between survival and extinction. The Maitian and Selong sections are so important that the International Commission on Stratigraphy designated them as the global reference sections for the Permian-Triassic boundary. They are, in a sense, the official document of the worst catastrophe in the history of life on Earth, written in stone and preserved for 252 million years. Modern research also employs techniques that would have been unimaginable to geologists 50 years ago. X-ray tomographs allow the interior of fossils to be studied without destroying them. Mass spectrometers measure isotope concentrations with extraordinary precision. Computerized climate models allow the atmospheric and oceanic conditions of the late Permian to be simulated in detail that was previously impossible. Each new technique adds a new level of detail to a picture that becomes clearer and more terrifying as we learn to read it. The complete recovery took between 10 and 15 million years. And when that recovery arrived, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before the extinction. The groups that had dominated the Permian had disappeared or been reduced to shadows of what they were. The groups that would dominate the Mesozoic were the survivors who had taken advantage of the empty space left by the catastrophe. The precision of modern radiometric dating has allowed the chronology of the Permian-Triassic boundary events to be established with great accuracy. Uranium lead dating techniques in zircon crystals, which can be measured with error margins of just tens of thousands of years on a scale of hundreds of millions, have confirmed that the most intense eruptions of the Siberian traps occurred at the same time as the peak of the extinction, and that the entire most acute process unfolded in an interval of less than 200,000 years. That temporal coincidence, established with a precision that would have been unimaginable just 30 years ago, is the most solid empirical basis for the causal link between Siberian volcanism and the Permian extinction. How do we know all this? How can we reconstruct in such detail what happened 252 million years ago, in a world so different from our own that it would be unrecognizable? The answer is in the rocks, and in the patience of the scientists who study them. The recovery of primary productivity after the Permian extinction, as recorded in the organic carbon content and isotopic composition of early Triassic sediments, was slower than the recovery of animal diversity. Even after animal communities had begun to rebuild, the productivity of the ocean, measured by the rate at which photosynthetic organisms converted carbon dioxide into organic matter, remained depressed for hundreds of thousands of years. That productivity depression had cascading effects on all higher trophic levels, because the abundance of primary producers ultimately sets the upper limit on the abundance of the animals that feed on them. The rebuilding of diverse animal communities required not just the availability of ecological niches, but also the recovery of the productivity base that could support those communities. Among those new dominators were the archosaurs, the group from which the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodilians would evolve. The Permian extinction did not directly create the dinosaurs, but it eliminated the dominant synapsids that would have competed with them, opening the way for the archosaurs to diversify and eventually dominate the Earth for 160 million years. The world of the dinosaurs, which we imagine as the natural world par excellence, was in reality the product of the greatest biological catastrophe in the history of the planet. The Permian-Triassic boundary, the geological moment at which the extinction occurred, is preserved in rock sequences in many parts of the world. The most important and best studied are found in China, particularly in the Maishan section in Zhejiang province and in the Selong section in Tibet. These localities are especially important because the rocks were deposited continuously and without interruption across the boundary, meaning they contain an unbroken record of the moment of the extinction. The Permian-Triassic boundary rocks also contain evidence of dramatic changes in the global carbon cycle that go beyond the simple addition of volcanic carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The carbon isotope record shows multiple rapid excursions, swings in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 that indicate not just a single perturbation but a series of repeated shocks to the carbon cycle. Each of those excursions likely represents a different release of carbon from a different source. Volcanic degassing from the Siberian traps, methane release from destabilized clathrates, burning of Permian coal deposits by the intrusion of magma, oxidation of organic carbon from dying marine organisms. The carbon cycle during the Permian-Triassic transition was not a simple perturbation returning to equilibrium, but a complex series of interacting feedbacks that kept the climate and ocean chemistry in a state of stress for hundreds of thousands of years. In those rocks, the Permian-Triassic boundary appears as a clay band just a few centimeters thick that separates two completely different worlds. Below that band, the sediments contain thousands of fossils of Permian marine organisms, brachiopods, trilobites, corals, crinoids, a rich and diverse fauna that had inhabited those seas for hundreds of millions of years. Above that band, almost nothing. Diversity collapses abruptly. The organisms that were ubiquitous below have disappeared. The few that remain are generalists, organisms capable of surviving in difficult conditions that the highly adapted specialists could not tolerate. The relationship between the Capitanian extinction and the end Permian extinction also raises questions about ecosystem resilience. After the Capitanian extinction, the ecosystems of the late Permian had 9 million years to recover and diversify again. And they did so, to some extent, though they never completely reached the diversity they had before the Capitanian. That means the ecosystems destroyed by the Siberian traps were already ecosystems that had suffered a prior trauma, that had already lost some of their most vulnerable members and may have been less resilient than if the Capitanian extinction had not occurred. The late Permian came to its end not as the pinnacle of 200 million years of uninterrupted evolution, but as the conclusion of a recovery period from a prior extinction. The study of oxygen isotopes in Permian and early Triassic fossils has also produced detailed records of temperature change across the extinction. Because organisms incorporate oxygen isotopes into their hard parts in a ratio that reflects the water temperature at the time of growth, the shells of ancient marine organisms contain a temperature record encoded in their chemistry. Those records show that the warming during the Permian-Triassic transition was rapid by any geological standard, occurring over tens of thousands of years rather than millions, and that temperatures in some tropical regions may have reached levels sustained for hundreds of thousands of years that exceed the thermal tolerance limits of most modern marine organisms. There is a detail of the Permian extinction that scientists have debated for decades and that is still not completely resolved. Whether the extinction was a single rapid event or a series of separate extinction pulses. The older view, which dominated paleontology for much of the 20th century, was that the Permian extinction was gradual, extending over millions of years. That view was replaced in recent decades by a picture of a much faster and more catastrophic event. But within that consensus about the general speed of the extinction, debate continues about whether there were one or several main pulses. Some studies have identified a prior extinction, called the Capitanian extinction, that occurred about 9 million years before the Permian-Triassic boundary and that had already significantly reduced the diversity of coral reefs and other marine organisms. That Capitanian extinction may have weakened the late Permian ecosystems, making them more vulnerable to the final blow of the Siberian traps. The deeper implications of the mercury record in the Permian-Triassic boundary rocks are also worth exploring. Mercury enters the marine sediment record through a specific pathway. It is released by volcanoes as a gas, transported globally by atmospheric circulation, deposited in soils and surface waters, bound to organic matter, and eventually buried in marine sediments. That pathway means that the mercury signal in ancient marine sediments is a genuine global signal, not a local one. When anomalously high mercury concentrations are found in Permian-Triassic boundary rocks on every continent and in every ocean basin studied, it reflects a globally distributed volcanic mercury source of extraordinary scale. Nothing else known in geology produces that kind of global mercury anomaly except flood basalt volcanism of the scale of the Siberian traps. There is also debate about the relative role of the different extinction mechanisms. How much of the damage was produced by warming? How much by ocean acidification? How much by anoxia and euxinia? How much by acid rain and wildfires in terrestrial ecosystems? The answers vary depending on the studies, the geographic localities, and the groups of organisms studied. What is clear is that none of those mechanisms operated in isolation. It was the combination and feedback between all of them that turned an episode of massive volcanism into the worst biological catastrophe in the history of complex life on Earth. The study of the Permian extinction has also contributed to our understanding of how ocean circulation responds to rapid warming. Modern oceanographers worry about the stability of the thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt of ocean currents driven by differences in temperature and salinity that distribute heat and oxygen around the world's oceans. Models suggest that rapid warming could slow or halt the thermohaline circulation, reducing oxygen transport to the deep ocean and potentially creating large-scale anoxia. The Permian extinction provides a real-world example of exactly this process at work, with a geological record documenting both the collapse of the ocean circulation and the consequences in terms of anoxia and euxinia. The Permian tells us that the fears about thermohaline circulation collapse are not theoretical. It has happened before, and when it happened, the consequences were devastating on a global scale. The research into the Permian extinction also has direct implications for the present. The mechanisms that produced that extinction, global warming by greenhouse gases, ocean acidification, marine anoxia, are not geological abstractions. They are processes occurring in today's oceans, driven by human activity. The current rate of warming does not reach that of the most intense phases of the Siberian traps, but the direction is the same, and the geological record of the Permian offers a warning about where that path can lead. The quantitative paleontology tools have also contributed new perspectives on the Permian extinction. Quantitative paleontology uses statistical methods to analyze fossil records systematically, correcting for the preservation and sampling biases that affect all paleontological datasets. Those analyses show that the Permian extinction was significantly larger than any other Phanerozoic extinction in terms of the percentage of lineages eliminated. They also show that the recovery was unusually slow compared with the other mass extinctions of the fossil record. The Permian extinction also has implications for how we think about the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem stability. One of the most counterintuitive findings from the study of the Permian extinction is that the most diverse ecosystems were not the most resistant to the extinction. The reefs of the Tethys Ocean, which were the most diverse marine ecosystems in the Permian, were also among the most completely devastated by the extinction. The simpler ecosystems of higher latitudes, with fewer species and shorter food chains, were more resistant. That pattern suggests that high biodiversity, while generally associated with ecosystem stability in the modern world, does not protect against environmental changes that exceed the tolerance of virtually all organisms simultaneously. The world that emerged from the Permian extinction was simpler, poorer, and stranger than the one that had preceded it. The early Triassic seas were dominated by organisms that in the Permian would have been marginal. Calcareous sponges, which had been secondary players in Permian reefs, became the dominant reef builders during the first millions of years of the Triassic, because the corals that built Permian reefs had disappeared. The first scleractinian coral reefs, the direct predecessors of modern reefs, did not appear until the Middle Triassic, several million years after the extinction. The study of the Permian extinction has also illuminated the concept of ecological memory, the way in which the history of past disturbances shapes the structure and function of present ecosystems. The modern ocean still bears the imprint of the Permian extinction in its taxonomic composition, its biogeographic patterns, and the evolutionary relationships between its inhabitants. Many of the distinctive features of modern marine ecosystems, the dominance of bivalves over brachiopods, the particular diversity patterns of modern fish, the geographic distribution of living fossil species in deep water refugia, are direct consequences of selection pressures and ecological opportunities created by the extinction 250 million years ago. Ecological memory operates on timescales that dwarf human history, and the Permian extinction is one of its most powerful examples. On land, early Triassic ecosystems had a structure that paleontologists describe as monotonous compared with the diversity of the late Permian. Forests were dominated by few plant species. The most abundant animals were generalists with broad diets and flexible physiological tolerance. Specialization, which is the engine of evolutionary diversification, requires environmental stability and intense ecological competition. In the early Triassic, there was very little stability and very little competition, because there were very few organisms. The recovery from the Permian extinction also shows that the relationship between diversity and stability can work in the opposite direction during recovery. Once a critical minimum diversity was re-established after the extinction, ecosystem recovery accelerated because the ecological interactions between species, the predator-prey relationships, the mutualistic associations, the competitive dynamics, began to create self-reinforcing structures that made the ecosystem more complex and more stable simultaneously. The recovery was not linear but showed a threshold effect, where a long period of slow and fragile rebuilding was followed by a more rapid phase of diversification once enough species were present to form a functional ecological network. But in that poverty a future richness was being seeded. The groups that survived the Permian extinction found a world with vacant ecological niches everywhere. The archosaurs, which in the Permian had been a minor group of undifferentiated reptiles, began to diversify at extraordinary speed in the Triassic. In less than 50 million years, they had given rise to the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodilians, and had become the absolute dominators of the planet's terrestrial ecosystems. The history of the end-Permian carbon cycle perturbation has also been illuminated by studies of individual fossil organisms rather than bulk sediment chemistry. Some researchers have analyzed the carbon isotope composition of individual brachiopod and bivalve shells from the Permian-Triassic boundary, tracking how the isotopic signal changed across the extinction in the shells of the actual organisms that lived through it. Those individual shell records show that the carbon isotope excursion was not uniform across all organisms but varied depending on the organism's physiology, depth habitat, and geographic location. Those variations provide constraints on the mechanisms of the carbon cycle perturbation that bulk sediment analyses cannot provide. The early Triassic recovery also provides insights into the resilience of different types of ecosystems. Terrestrial ecosystems, despite appearing more completely devastated than marine ecosystems at the height of the extinction, recovered somewhat faster in terms of taxonomic diversity, though not in terms of ecological complexity. This may reflect the fact that terrestrial organisms generally have shorter generation times and higher evolutionary rates than marine organisms, allowing faster evolutionary responses to the new environmental conditions. It may also reflect the fact that the continental climate stabilized faster than the ocean chemistry, which remained perturbed by acidification and anoxia for longer than the atmosphere recovered from the excess greenhouse gases. The mammals, or more precisely the advanced cynodonts that were the direct ancestors of the mammals, also diversified during the Triassic, though more modestly. During the Triassic and Jurassic, the proto-mammals were small, generally nocturnal animals that lived on the margins of a world dominated by dinosaurs. That marginal existence lasted more than 150 million years. And when the non-avian dinosaurs disappeared in another mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, the mammals were ready to repeat what their ancestors had done after the Permian: exploit the empty space and diversify to fill the world. The world of the Triassic also saw the diversification of conifers, which during the Triassic and Jurassic dominated the forests of middle and high latitudes in ways that still echo in today's boreal forests. The Triassic conifers were the survivors of the Permian forests, and their capacity to grow in poor and degraded soils was precisely what allowed them to recolonize the devastated landscapes of the early Triassic. From those humble beginnings, conifer forests would come to cover vast stretches of the northern continents for the next 200 million years. The Permian extinction also reshaped the evolutionary landscape in ways that extended far beyond the direct loss of species. The extinction eliminated not just species but entire evolutionary lineages, body plans that had been refined over hundreds of millions of years and that carried unique evolutionary potential. The trilobites, for example, had over their 300 million year history evolved dozens of fundamentally different body organizations, different numbers of thoracic segments, different eye types, different modes of enrollment, different feeding strategies. All of that evolutionary experimentation, accumulated over a timescale that makes all of human history look like a single instant, was erased. The universe of trilobite body plans that might have continued to diversify and produce novel evolutionary solutions was closed forever at the Permian-Triassic boundary. The geographic comparison also reveals something about the differential recovery capacity of different ecosystems. Regions that had the greatest diversity before the extinction took the longest to recover, because the extinction was most complete in them. Regions poorer in diversity before the extinction, paradoxically, recovered more quickly, because the survivors were generalists who adapted more easily to the changing conditions of the post-Permian world. It is another of the paradoxes of the Permian extinction. Richness was a disadvantage at the moment of catastrophe. The Permian extinction also has a geography. Not all parts of the world suffered it in the same way or at the same time. The regions closest to the Siberian traps experienced the effects most rapidly and with greatest intensity. The tropical oceans, where temperatures were already high before the extinction, were most affected by the additional warming. The polar regions, where temperatures were lower, offered temporary refuges to some organisms that could not survive in the overheated tropics. The loss of the rugose and tabulate corals also had consequences beyond the loss of reef habitats. Those corals represented a particular solution to the problem of building large calcareous structures from small polyps, a solution that had been refined over 200 million years of Paleozoic evolution. The Triassic scleractinian corals that replaced them represented an independently evolved solution to the same problem, built on a different biochemical and structural foundation. That evolutionary independence means that the modern coral reef world is not the continuation of the Paleozoic coral reef world, but rather its replacement, a fundamentally different biological system that happens to produce superficially similar structures. That geography of extinction has been reconstructed in increasing detail in recent years, through the comparison of fossil records from localities around the world. The most recent studies suggest that the extinction was not simultaneous across the entire planet, but began in some regions and spread to others as the environmental disturbances extended. In the Tethys Ocean, the great tropical ocean that separated Laurasia from Gondwana in the late Permian, the extinction was especially devastating. It was the ocean richest in biodiversity in the Permian, and its fauna was practically annihilated. The Permian extinction also illustrates the concept of ecological release, the process by which the disappearance of dominant groups allows previously suppressed groups to expand and diversify. In normal ecological conditions, competition and predation limit the diversification of most lineages. New ecological opportunities are quickly filled by the organisms already present, and there is little room for fundamentally new body plans or ecological strategies to gain a foothold. When a mass extinction removes the dominant organisms, the surviving groups suddenly have access to ecological opportunities that were previously unavailable. The archosaurs diversifying into dinosaurs, the cynodonts developing mammalian characteristics, the bivalves expanding into brachiopod niches, all of these are examples of ecological release operating after the Permian extinction on a massive and global scale. The deepest zones of the oceans also suffered a particular form of destruction. The anoxia and euxinia began in the deep waters and spread toward the surface as oceanic circulation degraded. The organisms living on the seafloor disappeared before those living in the water column. The fossil record reflects that sequence. The benthic fauna collapses before the pelagic fauna. The present-day distribution of some animal groups also reflects the geography of the Permian extinction. Brachiopods, which were the dominators of the seafloor in the Permian and which today are a relatively minor group with barely 300 species, concentrate their current diversity in the oceans of high latitudes and in deep waters, precisely the regions that offered refuge during the Permian extinction. Their current rarity in the tropics reflects the fact that tropical brachiopod populations were annihilated by the extinction and that bivalves, which survived better, occupied those niches in the Triassic and never abandoned them. The history of the Permian extinction also teaches us something about the role of contingency in the history of life. Many of the groups that became dominant after the extinction did not obviously deserve to become dominant based on their characteristics before the extinction. The archosaurs were not notably superior to the synapsids in the late Permian. The bivalves were not obviously better adapted than the brachiopods. The scleractinian coral solution to reef building was not self-evidently superior to the rugose and tabulate solution. What made the difference was survival through a catastrophe that was in many respects random, in which particular individuals and populations made it through, and the subsequent diversification of those survivors into a world of ecological opportunity. Contingency, the role of chance in evolutionary history, is never more apparent than in the aftermath of a mass extinction. There is a dimension of the Permian extinction that is rarely mentioned, but which deserves a moment of attention. All living things that exist on Earth today, without exception, are descended from the survivors of that catastrophe. The dog sleeping in some corner of your home, the bacteria in your microbiome, the tree growing on the street, the coral still building reefs in the tropical seas. All are descendants of the few organisms that survived a world that almost ended. All current life is entirely the lineage of the Permian survivors. That means there is a direct and unbroken connection between that catastrophe 252 million years ago and the present moment. The mammal ancestors that survived the Permian passed their genes to successive generations for 250 million years, through the age of the dinosaurs, through another mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, through 55 million years of mammalian evolution, until reaching the first primates, the first hominids, the first humans, and eventually us. That chain of survival and reproduction has never been broken even once in 250 million years. The Permian extinction also shaped the structure of the deep oceans in ways that persist to the present day. The elimination of the bioturbating fauna that churned the Permian seafloor allowed anoxic conditions to persist in the deep ocean for much longer than they would otherwise have done. The modern deep ocean, with its particular chemistry and biology, was shaped partly by the millions of years during which the post-Permian deep ocean was recovering its biological complexity. Some of the chemical gradients and redox boundaries that characterize modern oceanic sediments reflect the legacy of that long period of deep ocean anoxia following the greatest extinction in the history of complex life. The Permian extinction also reminds us of something about the nature of life that is simultaneously humbling and extraordinary. Life is not fragile. It is tenacious in a way that defies any catastrophe the planet has been able to produce. 96% of marine species disappeared, and yet the 4% that survived was sufficient to rebuild ecosystems of greater complexity than those that existed before. Life does not need everything to survive. It needs something to survive. The thermal maximum of the Permian-Triassic boundary, the period of greatest warming, was not instantaneous but lasted for several 100,000 years. During that time, the equatorial regions of the Earth were likely uninhabitable by most complex multicellular life. The fossil record shows a characteristic latitudinal pattern. The closer to the equator, the more complete and prolonged the extinction. The closer to the poles, the more survivors. That pattern reflects the geographic distribution of the thermal stress. Equatorial regions reached lethal temperatures first and stayed above them for longer, while polar regions, though also affected, never reached the extreme temperatures of the tropics. The few equatorial survivors of the extinction were almost certainly organisms with extraordinary heat tolerance or with the ability to exploit microhabitats that offered some buffering against the extreme external temperatures. That resilience does not minimize the magnitude of what was lost. The trilobites, which had been diversifying for 300 million years, disappeared forever. The rugose and tabulate corals that had built the Paleozoic reefs disappeared forever. The gorgonopsids, with their formidable fangs and their dominance of the late Permian terrestrial ecosystems, disappeared forever. That loss is real and irreversible. The possibility that the Permian extinction was preceded by significant biological changes that made the ecosystems more vulnerable has also been explored in recent research. Some studies have identified a progressive reduction in ecological diversity in the latest Permian, before the main extinction event, that could reflect increasing environmental stress from the early phases of Siberian trap volcanism. If the main extinction event hit ecosystems that were already under stress from decades or centuries of mild but cumulative environmental deterioration, that could help explain why the extinction was so rapid and so complete once it began. The ecosystems had already been weakened to the point where they could not absorb the additional stress of the main volcanic pulse. What the fossil record can do is give us perspective on the timescale in which life on Earth operates. The Permian extinction was a catastrophe of a magnitude that no human being can viscerally imagine. But it happened, and life survived. Not all life, and not immediately, but it survived. That perspective is one of the most important things paleontology can offer us. The perspectives that emerge from studying the Permian extinction are also deeply relevant to the current biodiversity crisis. The current rate of species loss, while not yet approaching the magnitude of the Permian extinction, is occurring at a rate many times faster than the background rate of extinction between mass extinction events. The groups that are currently most at risk, reef-building corals, large vertebrates at the top of food chains, organisms with narrow geographic ranges and specialized ecological requirements, are precisely the groups that were most devastated by the Permian extinction. The patterns are not identical, but the parallels are informative. The resilience of life that the Permian extinction demonstrates is not a guarantee of any particular outcome for any particular group of organisms, including our own species. Life as a whole has survived everything the Earth has thrown at it for 4 billion years. Individual lineages, individual species, individual body plans have not been so fortunate. The trilobites were as much a part of life as we are, and they are gone. The gorgonopsids were as much a part of life, and they are gone. The Permian reef systems were as much a part of life, and they are gone. The resilience of life as a whole is compatible with the extinction of any particular component of it. What the Permian extinction teaches us about resilience is that life recovers, eventually, in some form. What we do not want is to find out firsthand how long eventually takes. The evolutionary perspective on the Permian extinction also illuminates something about the nature of mass extinctions in general. Mass extinctions do not eliminate life at random. They have biases. They preferentially eliminate organisms with narrow physiological tolerance ranges, those that depend on very specific environmental conditions, those that occupy high positions in food chains, and those with low reproduction rates and small populations. Generalists, organisms that can tolerate a wide range of conditions, those with high reproduction rates and those that can exploit a variety of food resources, have a greater probability of surviving. That selectivity of mass extinctions has profound evolutionary consequences. The worlds that emerge after mass extinctions are not simply impoverished versions of the previous world. They are worlds dominated by different types of organisms, built on different body plans, with different ecological strategies. The post-Permian world was not just a Permian with fewer species. It was a fundamentally reorganized world, in which the groups that had been dominant had disappeared or been reduced and previously marginal groups were becoming the new ecosystem builders. The question of whether humans would be different without the Permian extinction is fascinating though inevitably speculative. Without the Permian extinction, synapsids like the gorgonopsids might have continued to dominate the terrestrial ecosystems. The cynodonts, our ancestors, might have remained in a secondary role, without the opportunity to evolve toward the complexity that finally produced the mammals. The archosaurs might never have had the opportunity to diversify into dinosaurs. And without dinosaurs dominating the terrestrial ecosystems during the Mesozoic, the mammals would not have remained small and nocturnal for 150 million years, and might have taken a completely different evolutionary path. The Permian extinction also reminds us that recovery from mass extinction is not guaranteed to restore what was lost. The post-Permian world eventually became as ecologically complex and as biologically productive as the Permian world, but it was a different complexity and a different productivity, built by different organisms playing different ecological roles. If the current biodiversity crisis reaches the scale of a mass extinction, the world that eventually emerges from it will be one populated by the descendants of today's survivors, shaped by the ecological opportunities created by the loss of today's most vulnerable species. It will be a world with complex and functional ecosystems, but not our world. Not the world of the organisms and the ecological relationships that human civilization developed alongside. There exists, of course, no guarantee that that alternative path would have produced anything remotely resembling a human being. Complex intelligence and symbolic language that define us might have emerged in a completely different lineage, or might not have emerged at all. The Permian extinction did not predetermine us, but it contributed to creating the conditions that made possible the evolutionary path that finally produced us. We are, in that sense, children of the catastrophe. The lessons of the Permian extinction for the current management of ocean chemistry are concrete and specific. The acidification of the modern ocean, driven by the absorption of anthropogenic carbon dioxide, is occurring at a rate that is geologically rapid, though still slower than the most intense phases of the Permian carbon release. The organisms most affected by ocean acidification in the modern ocean are precisely the calcifying organisms that were most devastated by the Permian acidification: corals, mollusks, echinoderms, and the calcareous plankton that forms the base of many ocean food chains. The Permian tells us that ocean acidification, if sustained and intense enough, can collapse entire categories of marine ecosystem. The question for the modern ocean is not whether acidification is harmful, but how much acidification the modern ocean's organisms can tolerate before similar collapses begin to occur. That connection between the Permian extinction and our own existence is not simply a curious fact. It is a perspective that can change how we think about our place in the history of life. We are not the inevitable destination of evolution, the expected product of billions of years of biological history. We are the contingent result of a series of catastrophes and recoveries, extinctions and diversifications, accidents and adaptations, that could at any moment have taken a different path. There is something in the history of the Permian extinction that connects with the way human beings experience time and change. The question of what we owe to the survivors of the Permian extinction goes beyond the evolutionary debt. We owe them not just our existence but also our intellectual capacity to understand the story of that existence. the brain that allows us to read the geological record of the Permian-Triassic boundary, to understand the chemistry of mass extinctions, to construct the narrative of deep time and our place within it, is a mammalian brain, the product of a lineage of evolution that goes back unbroken to those surviving synapsids of the early Triassic. Our capacity for abstract thought, for language, for scientific inquiry, is part of the evolutionary inheritance that those survivors transmitted down 250 million years of unbroken generations. We live our lives on timescales ranging from seconds to decades. Recorded human history spans just a few thousand years. The history of our species, Homo sapiens, is barely 300,000 years old. Compared with these numbers, the 252 million years that have passed since the Permian extinction are literally incomprehensible to the human mind. We cannot experience that time in any direct way. We can only represent it abstractly, through numbers and comparative scales. And yet the Permian extinction affects us in direct and concrete ways. We live in the world it built. The dinosaurs that populate our collective imagination would not have existed without the Permian extinction. The mammals, including our own species, would not have existed without the Permian extinction. The current biodiversity of the planet is the product of the evolution that occurred after that catastrophe from the survivors. The Permian extinction also offers a perspective on current climate change that is simultaneously sober and nuanced. Sober, because it shows what can happen when greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere at sufficient speed. Ecosystem collapse, mass extinction, degradation of the oceans for millions of years. Nuanced, because the timescale of the Permian extinction was different from that of current climate change. The Siberian traps released their gases over tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, while human activity is releasing comparable quantities in centuries. There is something profound about the fact that the only species that has ever understood the story of the Permian extinction is also the species most capable of causing a comparable crisis. That double nature, the capacity both to understand deep time and to act in ways that ignore it, is perhaps the defining characteristic of our moment in the history of life. We are the first species in the history of this planet to know what a mass extinction looks like from the inside of the geological record. We are also the first species to be capable of deliberately avoiding one, if we choose to act on that knowledge. That choice, which is being made in this generation, will be part of the geological record of our own time that future paleontologists, if there are any, will read millions of years from now. The acceleration that implies, the idea that we are compressing into centuries processes that geologically took millennia, is one of the reasons why paleoclimatologists and mass extinction specialists observe the present with attention. They are not saying we are going to repeat the Permian. They are saying that the mechanisms that produced the Permian are the same ones being activated now, and that the geological record shows clearly where those mechanisms lead when left to operate without restriction. What the Permian extinction ultimately teaches us is not fatalism but understanding. Understanding the mechanisms of a catastrophe is the first step to avoiding repeating it. And having the perspective of geological time, knowing that life has survived the worst the planet could do, is also a particular form of hope. Not because it guarantees that everything will turn out well, but because it reminds us that life is extraordinarily tenacious, that catastrophes come to an end, and that from the darkest moments worlds of a richness that no one would have predicted can emerge. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, the world around you carries the imprint of the Great Permian Extinction. The contingency of our own existence is not a reason for despair, but for a particular kind of wonder. The fact that we might so easily not have been here, that our evolutionary line survived the Permian by the narrowest of margins, that we exist because a few small synapsids found enough to eat in the devastated early Triassic world, makes the fact of our existence and our consciousness something remarkable rather than inevitable. Every generation of our ancestors, from those first post-Permian synapsids to the first Homo sapiens, survived long enough to reproduce. Every single one. The probability of that unbroken chain is vanishingly small. And yet here we are, the improbable product of 250 million years of contingent survival, contemplating the very extinction that made us possible. The dogs and cats that share our homes are mammals, and mammals descend from the synapsids that survived the Permian with difficulty. The birds that sing in the morning are dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are archosaurs, and archosaurs owed their opportunity to diversify to the empty space left by the Permian extinction. The coral reefs that still exist in the ocean are built by scleractinian corals that diversified in the Triassic after their Permian predecessors disappeared. The structure of the life we know was molded in a fundamental way by an event that occurred 252 million years ago. The role of ocean deoxygenation in the current crisis of marine biodiversity has been highlighted by researchers who study the Permian extinction precisely because of its relevance to the present. The modern ocean is losing oxygen at a measurable rate as it warms, with oxygen minimum zones expanding in many ocean basins. While the current deoxygenation is far less severe than what occurred during the Permian extinction, the direction of change is the same. The Permian tells us that sustained and severe deoxygenation can eliminate virtually all complex animal life from vast areas of the ocean. The question for the modern ocean is at what point the ongoing deoxygenation, combined with warming and acidification, begins to produce ecosystem consequences comparable in kind if not yet in magnitude to those of the Great Dying. There is something in that perspective that can accompany sleep in a particular way. The concerns of the day, the urgencies that seem so important when we are awake, are placed differently when contemplated from the scale of geological time. It is not that they stop mattering. It is that they acquire their true proportion. The world has gone through something incomparably more difficult than anything human beings have experienced in our brief history as a species, and life moved forward. Not all life, and not immediately, but it moved forward. The Great Permian Extinction is also a reminder that the planet is not a passive backdrop for the story of life. It is an active participant, capable of transformations that change the rules of the game in ways no individual organism can foresee or resist. That is a truth that geology teaches clearly. The Earth has its own history, prior to and greater than our own, and that history continues to unfold independently of what we do. The Permian extinction also invites reflection on what it means to lose something irreplaceable. The trilobites are gone. Not reduced, not endangered, but completely and permanently gone from the universe. Their extraordinary visual systems, which in some species included lenses of calcite that corrected for spherical aberration in ways only rediscovered by human optics in the 20th century, exist nowhere. Their capacity to roll into a tight protective ball, refined over 300 million years into dozens of different mechanisms in different lineages, exists nowhere. The ecological roles they played in Paleozoic seas, the specific predator-prey relationships they were part of, the biochemical cycles they participated in, all of it is gone. What we can know of them is only what the fossil record has preserved, which is the skeleton of their existence, not its full living reality. And yet, for the first time in the 4.5 billion years of this planet's history, there is a species that can read that history, that can excavate the rocks of the Permian-Triassic boundary, measure their isotopes, reconstruct the climate of 250 million years ago, identify the mechanisms of the catastrophe and extract lessons applicable to the present. That capacity is one of the most extraordinary things that evolution has produced. We are the descendants of the Permian survivors. We carry in our genes the inheritance of every catastrophe that life has overcome. And we carry also the capacity, unique in the history of this planet, to understand those catastrophes and to act from that understanding. The Permian extinction also gives us a window into the future of the Earth that is both humbling and clarifying. In the very long run, the geological forces that produced the Permian extinction, volcanism, climate change, shifts in ocean chemistry, will continue to operate on Earth for billions of years into the future. There will be other mass extinctions, caused by volcanic events or asteroid impacts or changes in solar output or the gradual brightening of the sun, that will reshape the biosphere in ways as dramatic as the Permian extinction reshaped it. The current biodiversity crisis, whatever its ultimate magnitude, is one episode in an ongoing geological story that began more than 4 billion years ago and will continue until the sun finally expands and makes the Earth uninhabitable in another 5 billion years. That perspective does not diminish the moral urgency of preserving today's biodiversity. But it does place that urgency in a context of geological time that is simultaneously sobering and strangely consoling. Rest now with that thought. The world we inherited took 250 million years to build. It deserves to be known, and it deserves to be cared for. If this journey kept you company tonight, the Permian extinction is also a reminder of how much science has changed our understanding of Earth history in just a few generations. The geologists who first mapped the Permian-Triassic boundary rocks in China and Russia in the 19th and early 20th centuries had no concept of plate tectonics, no understanding of greenhouse warming, no knowledge of ocean anoxia as an extinction mechanism. They saw the sharp change in fossil faunas and knew something dramatic had occurred, but they lacked the conceptual framework to understand what. The development of that framework, from the plate tectonic revolution of the 1960s through the refinement of geochemical proxies in the 1980s and 1990s to the high-resolution dating and climate modeling of today, is one of the great intellectual achievements of 20th and 21st century science. Understanding the Permian extinction required building entirely new scientific disciplines. Rest now with that knowledge. The world around you is the product of 250 million years of survival, recovery, and diversification following the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. Every organism sharing this planet with you is a fellow descendant of the survivors of the Great Dying. That shared history, written in the deep time of the geological record, is one of the most remarkable stories ever told by the Earth itself. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. The history of the Earth is filled with worlds waiting to be explored, each one stranger and more extraordinary than the last. Every week we travel further into deep time, with a calm narration designed to accompany your rest. There are many more worlds waiting for us in the dark. The Permian extinction also gives us a way of thinking about hope and catastrophe that is neither falsely optimistic nor needlessly dark. The catastrophe was real. The suffering of the organisms that lived through it, if they could suffer in ways meaningful to us, was enormous and extended over tens of thousands of years. The loss was irreversible. None of that is minimized by the fact that life recovered. But the recovery also was real, and it produced a world of extraordinary richness and complexity. Both things are true simultaneously. The catastrophe was terrible, and life overcame it. Holding both of those truths together, without letting either one cancel the other, is perhaps the most mature perspective that deep time offers us. Tonight, when you close your eyes, you can carry with you the awareness that you are part of a lineage of survivors. Your atoms have been through geological cycles that make the history of civilization look like a single afternoon. The carbon in your body was once in the atmosphere of the Permian world, in the tissues of organisms that lived and died before the extinction, in the volcanic gases released by the Siberian traps, in the sediments of the early Triassic recovery, in the tissues of 1,000 generations of organisms that lived and died between the Permian and today. You are the universe thinking about itself, assembled from ancient atoms, shaped by ancient catastrophes, contemplating the deep history that made you possible.